Hello, welcome to my presentation. My name is Rebecca Barnes. I'm a PhD student in Spanish literature at Temple University, and today I'll be presenting my paper, Nationless States and Stateless Beings, The Politics of Identity and Citizenship in Claudio Mir's Mondongo Scam and Cheech Marin's Born in East L.A. I'd like to commence with this quote from Jacques Derrida's essay, Declarations of Independence, in which he says, "The we of the Declaration speaks in the name of the people. But this people does not exist. They do not exist as an entity. It does not exist before this declaration, not as such. If it gives birth to itself as free and independent subject, as possible signer, this can hold only in the act of the signature. The signature invents the signer." Now, within this quote, Derrida is analyzing the symbolic weight of the Founding Fathers' signature on the Declaration of Independence. And he essentially postulates that the Declaration of Independence did not simply declare their rights to liberty, but in fact created it. And before the signing, the members of the English colonies in the US, in what is known as the US today, were in fact diasporic members of England, because there were no borders separating Great Britain from its colonies. Now, although the word diaspora was not being used in 1777 as it is today, bringing up this fact does destabilize certain notions of belonging and citizenship and nationalism that exist in today's narrative surrounding the United States. As it relates to diasporic studies, I would like to point out that since the US's geopolitical borders are so novel and also, not to use too strong a word, a little bit arbitrary, it is important to start thinking about other diasporas and their potential to create more inclusive social bodies. Now, the word diaspora comes from the Greek prefix dia, which means through, and the suffix spirin, to scatter. And diaspora denotes a community that remains united with and perhaps in spite of geopolitical borders. Now, in order to be a member of a diasporic community, you must be upholding a cultural or social heritage in any variety of ways, whilst living in a place that does not have the same customs. Now, although this term is commonly used with other terms like expatriatism, transnationalism, immigration, migration, and exile, I suggest it be understood more as an existential status, given the wide variety of ways that diasporic members can maintain and express their identity, and sort of grapple with other questions of legal citizenship and belonging and social acceptance that can complicate that relationship. Now, before exploring the implications of the nationless state and its effect on stateless beings, I'd like to point out the use or the purpose of the state as an establishment. As Hannah Arendt points out in The Human Condition, humans are a naturally social animal, like other animals in the animal kingdom. And this socialness comes from the Latin societas, which indicates an alliance between people for a specific purpose, as when men organize in order to rule others or to commit a crime. In other words, Arendt points out that society is a way in which humans can conglomerate and pursue goals beyond their immediate needs. In this way, we provide the basis for everything that it has to do with social belonging, politics, and citizenship, because it is very important for the development and survival of human beings. And to continue that point, Homi Bhabha also points out that contemporary life in a state that does not accept you or that rejects you, can lead to an existential void and a lot of confusion about identity. So, to commence this analysis, I ask the question, if the US establishment perpetuates a worldview where only white Anglo-Saxon Protestants can be accepted, where do the members of cultural diasporas who do not fit this mold belong? Specifically, the members of Latin American and Central American diasporas in the US today. Now, the goal of analyzing Claudio Mir's play and Cheech Marin's film today is to highlight the importance of recognizing diasporic membership as a form of social and political identity that can be readily accepted and respected. In order to do this, I will be analyzing the performatic techniques that Claudio Mir and Cheech Marin use to denote the inherent ambivalence and confusion that intersectionality can bring to diasporic individuals. So Mir's play, Claudio Mir's play Mondongo Scam, written in 2005, escenifies a protagonist that is torn between nations. And Cheech Marin's film, it's from 1987, kind of shows a border crossing narrative, but in reverse. So in both narratives, the personal struggle of the protagonist shows social spaces that do not correlate to geographic divisions, and also highlights their inherent hybridity and the confusion that can arise from coming from two different cultures in contact. Now, in Claudio Mir's Mondongo Scam, here we have a photo of Claudio Mir himself acting it out. The play itself is written as what Camilla Stevens refers to as a polymonologue, which is essentially one person who speaks, but there is another side of the conversation that the audience does not see or hear. So Claudio Mir incarnates the protagonist Casiano, who is a Dominican-born immigrant who has come to the United States on a visa, and then he overstays his visa and starts adopting new identities and social security numbers in order to work and stay in the United States. What he explains throughout the play is that his adoption of these identities went much further than simply adopting their social security numbers. In fact, he did try and become each and every one of these identities, all of which varying in gender, age, and ethnicities. Now, Claudio Mir sort of manipulates the audience into questioning their own prejudices using certain performatic techniques, as well as by putting on stage the confusion that this diasporic member has, because having come from the Dominican Republic, which was torn apart by Hurricane David in 1979, he feels that he has no home to go back to. His town was ravaged by this hurricane, and coming to the United States, he finds that he is rejected from that society as well, and also exploited by his fellow diasporic members. So, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. So, as mentioned before, the protagonist in Cheech Marin's Born in East L.A., his name is Rudy, finds himself in a similar yet inverse situation than Casiano. This is a comical reformulation of the traditional border crossing narrative, because Rudy, originally an unambitious mechanic of Mexican descent living in East L.A., is a U.S. citizen who despite having grown up in a family that is very conscious of their Mexican culture, does not speak Spanish and does not demonstrate an interest in maintaining his Central American identity, and instead simply tries to be someone from East Los Angeles. However, after a series of unfortunate mishaps, he is construed as an illegal immigrant, rounded up and deported into Mexico, and finds himself unable to come back home. Now, this movie is written with a much more optimistic tone than Mir's Mondongo Scam, but it does show a different side of how a member of a diaspora can have a relationship with their duality, because Rudy himself is forced to recognize the other part of his identity that he was willfully ignoring, and flourishes as a result. So the comparison between Casiano and Rudy affords us a continuum on which diasporic members can treat their transnationalism. So as it was mentioned before, Casiano in Mondongo Scam is in a courtroom speaking with a judge, defending himself in a case wherein he's accused of identity theft. In this conversation, the judge actually does not speak. It is only Casiano who is responding to the questions, and each of his answers indicate to the audience what the question asked was. And throughout his explanation, Cassiano goes into detail about how his adoption of these identities, of these social security numbers, was in fact a type of possession, that he became these people, that he adopted an identity, for example, of an Ishmael Rosenthal, a Jewish gentleman, a Jewish older gentleman, and started wearing a yarmulke and eating bagels with cream cheese, and actually calling himself Ishmael. Now, throughout this mystical connection with the deceased people that he becomes, quote unquote, Cassiano is displaying extreme assimilation and acculturation. For Fernando Ortiz, acculturation would be a type of disassociation with his original culture in the effort to assimilate, or in other words, to fit in to U.S. culture and to be accepted. The fact that the judge does not speak is a key performative detail in the message about citizenship of the play, because it is silencing the voice of establishment and giving the voice to the minority. And also, as Cassiano starts to dance and speak in gibberish words, this obligates the audience to at first distrust him, but also to be an outsider and not understand him. And in this way, if it's sort of a meta commentary both on Cassiano's solitude and also on the prejudices of the audience. Now, more on the use of language in Mondongo Scam. Claudio Mir peppers Cassiano's narrative with broken English and a little bit of Spanish in the beginning, but his code switching is very rudimentary. And as he degenerates throughout the monologue, he starts using more and more of a fabricated language. For example, I can get along with anybody. Suiki baru tiki nolika ti tia nalai. In the name of the Lord, I reprehend you, Satan. Excuse me, Your Honor, I beg your pardon. So here we see a run-on sentence that's very choppy. Not only does this symbolize the inherent fragmentation that Cassiano is feeling, having lost his, or having intentionally shed his Dominican identity, and then being stripped of the identities that he adopted in the United States. Now Cassiano is in an in-between state where he really has no native tongue. He doesn't feel comfortable being himself. And critic Karolina Majkowska refers to this as an inherent marker of the migrant condition, this in-betweenness. Because the use of linguistic hybridity in a performance highlights the character's exclusion from certain communities, thus stressing their in-between position. And for Cassiano, this is an unresolved in-betweenness by the end of the play. Now, Cassiano's adoption of new identities can be interpreted as a form of mimetic parasitism. Of course, mimetic refers to the act of mimesis, to mimic something, and parasitism inherently denotes the absorption of an other. So this can be interpreted in two ways. Either Cassiano can be seen as a parasite himself. As I had mentioned before, he becomes every bit of Ishmael Rosenthal. He wears a yarmulke, he eats bagels with cream cheese, and he proclaims, "What am I? German and Russian, French and Argentinian, Italian, Spaniard, and Dominican." So in his absorption of the other, he all but effaces the true Cassiano and becomes Ishmael in order to blend into society. Now, critic Sean Corner would interpret this as a deeply political stance, because the parasite is an inherently marginal being that acts as witness to the structure of social relations. And I quote, "The parasite is a fundamentally ambivalent figure, neither fully integrated nor entirely rejected. The stranger whose status is not properly resolved, but who remains an outsider within." I relate this to the title as well, because Mondongo is a Latin American dish made from intestines with tostones, fried plantains, and lots of herbs and spices. And this is sort of representative of something that's associated with feces that needs to be meticulously cleaned, something that was once eaten out of need. So I think that the theme of parasitism is there. On the other hand, Cassiano can also be interpreted as a host. At one point, his public defender does say, the defendant is a victim of culture, a victim of unnatural forces. He is the host killed by the parasite. Cassiano as host is a very multifaceted relationship because he is simultaneously exploited by the United States as well as by his fellow diasporic members. First of all, Cassiano came to the United States with very good intentions of being a tax-paying citizen and working and, spending money and boosting the economy. And after 3 months of only spending money, the U.S. chooses to deport him. So in that way, it's kind of using him, exploiting him, and then throwing him out. On the other hand, he is also exploited by other Latin Americans. There's a woman that he falls in love with who is convinced that she can marry him for a green card. And then she leaves him when she finds out that he doesn't actually have a green card. And he's also raped by a man who says, don't worry, I am also a member of a minority as well. So in this way, he himself is exploited and consumed and then eventually rejected by the society that he wants to be a part of. For Michel Serres, he says, we parasite each other and live amidst parasites, which is more or less a way of saying that they constitute our environment. In more distinguished terms, we are speaking of an organic model for the members of society. So in that way, Cassiano can also be the host. I would further interpret this when he speaks about how he was raised thinking of New York as an idyllic place in which everyone prospered. And then finally he arrived only to find that he was not welcome and that people suffer there too. So in that sense, there's also a grander commentary on how the United States has exploited Latin America and convinced Latin Americans that this is the land of prosperity, but that it's unattainable. So as it was mentioned before, Born in East L.A. is a comical reformulation of the traditional illegality narrative. Rudy's struggle in this film could be representative of the Central American diasporic experience, whereas Cassiano's is of the Caribbean. As Sarah Warren confirms in her article, identity politics in Latin America have been defined by their intersectionality. And for Rudy, his intersectionality is a constant source of confusion, seeing as he willfully ignores his Central American roots and actively does not explore that part of his identity. Homi Bhabha points out that the issue of diasporic knowledge, and this is a good example of what Rudy suffers, diasporic knowledge comes with the responsibility of maintaining the cultural memory and the customs and the general mental archives of that community, of the diasporic community, lest it be whitewashed, lest it be forgotten. And Rudy, throughout his struggle in this film, is forced to recognize that knowledge. So throughout the film, in order to indicate Rudy's duality and ambivalence, there are several nationalistic and racist tropes that are put on screen to make the audience question their own prejudices about Rudy and stereotypes that they hold. So, as critic Rosa Fregoso puts it, I quote, Marin renders a depiction of Chicano social reality through humor rather than a serious political style. And an example of this humor is in the opening credits. He is ogling a woman who's got long white legs and red hair and a green dress and pink pumps, and she turns out to have a French accent. And she comes to his body shop, and she's codified with the colors of the Mexican flag, but she's also a post-colonial ideal of beauty. And I don't believe it's a coincidence that she's a European woman. I think that all of these aspects, these details, are mini commentaries on the various levels of culture that go into the Latin American consciousness in the US, because not only do you have the contemporary Latin American aspect, you also have the indigenous factor, you also have the European factor, and then all in the social atmosphere of contemporary United States. Fregoso also points out that this woman resembles the Statue of Liberty, which for her, the sexualization of this woman is a critique of the hypocrisy of dominant culture. So this is just a good example of the humor that Marin employs to send more serious messages about diasporic realities. In keeping with Fernando Ortiz's terminology, Rudy's experience can be best characterized as neoculturation, or the creation of new cultural phenomena, because he personally flourishes once he decides to integrate his Central American identity into every aspect of his life. This hybridity is most clearly addressed in the film when Rudy is tasked to teach other Central Americans how to act like a Mexican. Not only in this moment is there representation of the indigenous populations, because his pupils are Mayan and they don't speak English nor Spanish. This is also a direct confrontation that Rudy has with other individuals who do not share his hybridity. These Mayans do not, although they are outside of their normal circumstances, they do not belong to two cultures. They are purely indigenous. Whereas Rudy teaches them how to act like a Mexican in East L.A. And the behavioral tricks that he teaches them, such as wearing the bandana very low on their eyes and saying, "What's happening?" that's written on the wall behind him, show not only Mexican influences, but also U.S. influences. So we see here how Rudy's demeanor is marked by both, and he would not be himself without either one. Overall, Rudy's existential transformation is representative of a very particular diasporic consciousness in the United States, because he shows not only how diasporic members are seen, but also how they see themselves. And Cheech Marin does well to use certain performatic tools to manipulate not only the audience's prejudices towards the character himself, but also with the character's prejudices against himself. One of the tools used is Rudy's clothing. When he's in Los Angeles before his deportation, he wears a red hat that you can see on the left that says "No cerveza, no trabajo," which can be interpreted in two ways. On the one hand, it can be, if there's no beer, I don't work, which elicits the typical, the stereotype of the lazy Mexican who will refuse to work unless he is provided with instant gratification. But on the other hand, "No cerveza, no trabajo" could be no beer and no work, which is another trope that the Mexican-American man has nothing. On the other hand, after he is deported, his hat changes to the LA baseball cap. Not only do both hats are they codified with the colors of the American flag, but it is very interesting that whenever, depending on his environment, depending which side of the border he is on, he seems to represent the other, which is symbolic for Rudy's self and his other, showing not only his duality, but also the fact that for diasporic members, they're very malleable in the sense that depending on where they are, they will have certain characteristics that are more evident in certain situations than others. Overall, Rudy also shows how the Latin American other is treated in the United States, how this diasporic consciousness is constantly fettered with persecution and threats of deportation and general racism, and how that needs to be changed. Both Mir's play and Marin's film demonstrate identity struggles on the individual level, but at the heart of the issue lies United States politics and its rejection of the Latin American diaspora that exists in this country. This rejection creates subjects with very few resources to survive. In other words, nationless states create stateless beings. We come back to the title of this essay. By showcasing the results of these struggles, playwrights and directors can help their audiences better understand the migrant condition and question their own prejudiced tendencies towards the Latin American other. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias for listening to my presentation.